everything you were taught about ancient warfare. In the jungles of the Philippines, blades weren't primitive. They were engineered to break enemies' minds.
And history itself. This isn't myth. This is the truth they never wanted remembered.
Forget everything you think you know about pre-colonial warfare, because the story you were taught was designed to make you look away before you ever understood what was really happening. And it begins in the thick heat of an island morning where the air itself feels alive, where the sea breathes against the shore and the jungle watches in silence as Filipino warriors prepare themselves not for glory but for survival, where blades are not lifted for conquest but carried as extensions of memory, grief, love, and duty. And long before foreign sails appeared on the horizon, there were already rules to fighting here, rules written in steel and blood and rhythm, rules born from centuries of watching how bodies fall, how fear spreads, how a single mistake can end a family line. And this is where the lie of the so-called soft weapon begins to rot, because nothing about these weapons was accidental or crude, nothing was made for show, everything was shaped by necessity, by enemies who learned quickly and died faster. And as the sun rises, we see a young Filipino warrior named Datu Kalinawan standing barefoot on packed earth, his breath slow, his hand steady as he holds a kris that curves like a living thing, its blade catching the light in a way that feels unsettling, almost wrong, as if the metal itself refuses to be still. And elders watch him not with pride but with concern, because today is not training. Today is the day he will test whether the stories are true, whether a blade can carry the weight of generations, whether the weapon in his hand can do what it was designed to do. Because out there beyond the trees another group is advancing, armed with straight blades, shields, confidence, and the belief that anything not shaped like their weapons must be inferior. And this belief has killed many before them, and the jungle remembers all of it, remembers the cries, the sudden silences, the way bodies vanish into leaves and mud. And Kalinawan remembers too, because he was a child when his father fell, cut down not because he was weak but because he hesitated, because he forgot what his weapon demanded of him. And that lesson burned itself into Kalinawan's bones, that a Filipino blade is not meant to be swung wildly or admired from a distance. It is meant to control space, to break rhythm, to unmake the enemy's confidence before flesh is ever cut. And as he steps forward now, the kris does not move like a sword. It twists, it pulls, it bites, its waves, creating resistance that tears deeper than a straight edge ever could. And when it meets bone, it does not glance away, it grabs, it locks, it refuses to let go. And the first clash happens so fast it feels unreal, a rush of motion where an attacker overcommits, expecting a clean parry, and instead his blade slides along the curves and his wrist opens, blood spilling before he even understands why his hand no longer obeys him. And this is where fear enters the field, because fear is not loud at first. It whispers, it tells the others that something here is wrong, that the rules they know do not apply, and the kris was designed for this moment, its shape confusing the eye, breaking expectations, turning defense into attack without pause. And Kalinawan moves not with rage but with calculation, every step drilled into him since childhood, every angle chosen to keep the blade alive. Because in Filipino warfare the weapon is treated like a companion, fed with oil, named, respected, and never blamed when things go wrong, because blame belongs to the hand and the heart. And as the fight spreads, the battlefield becomes a blur of movement, not lines and formations but sudden collisions, close quarters chaos where long straight blades struggle to find space while the kris thrives, hooking, slicing, redirecting force. And the psychological damage is worse than the physical, because the enemy cannot predict what comes next. And that unpredictability was the point, because Filipino warriors understood something others did not, that warfare is not about strength alone, it is about stealing certainty from the other side. And when certainty dies, everything else follows. And as bodies fall and screams echo, another figure steps forward from the trees carrying something heavier, broader, darker. A Panabas that looks less like a sword and more like a moving wall of steel. And his name is Lakan Bato, older, scarred, moving with the calm of someone who has buried too many brothers to fear death anymore. And where the kris is subtle and deceptive, the Panabas is honest, brutal, engineered for clearing space, for cutting through shields, limbs, and morale in a single arc. And when it swings, it does not need speed, it needs commitment. And Bato gives it fully, each strike forcing the enemy back, breaking formations, turning their advance into retreat. And this too was intentional, because Filipino arsenals were never about a single perfect weapon but about systems, about roles, about understanding terrain and timing and human weakness. And the Panabas was born from forest warfare, from the need to end fights quickly before reinforcements could arrive, from the knowledge that hesitation meant annihilation. And as Bato advances, Kalinawan adjusts, their movements sinking without words, One blade confusing and trapping, the other finishing and clearing, a dance learned through shared hardship, through nights of hunger and rain and whispered promises to protect their people or die trying, and around them younger warriors fight with barong blades, shorter, leaf-shaped, designed for close, explosive encounters, blades meant to enter deep and not come back out cleanly, weapons shaped by the understanding that armor is rare, that speed matters, that survival favors the one who ends the exchange first. And every weapon here tells a story of island geography, of intertribal conflict, of raids and defenses and the constant need to adapt. And this adaptation gave birth to martial systems that outsiders would later misunderstand, dismissing them as chaotic when in truth they were highly structured, built around angles, flow, sensitivity, and the ability to transition seamlessly from weapon to empty hand. Because a Filipino warrior never assumed the blade would stay in his grasp. He trained for loss, for injury, for the moment when steel slips and only instinct remains, and that instinct was shaped by the weapon long before it was ever tested. And as the battle reaches its breaking point, the enemy begins to flee, not because they have been wiped out but because their will has collapsed, because they have learned that these are not primitive tools wielded by desperate men, these are tactical masterpieces wielded by warriors who understand violence too well to romanticize it. And when silence finally returns, it is heavy, broken only by breathing and the distant sea, and Kalinawan stands shaking not from fear but from release, from the weight of having survived what his father did not, and Bato places a hand on his shoulder, not in celebration but in acknowledgement, because victory here is never clean, it always carries loss, and as bodies are gathered and the dead honored, the blades are cleaned, thanked, returned to their sheaths, and the people move on knowing this will not be the last time they fight, that more enemies will come, some with new weapons, new ideas, new lies about superiority, and generations later, those lies will grow louder, carried by colonizers who will call these blades savage, who will write histories that erase the intelligence behind the curves and weights and balances, who will ignore the martial arts that grew from this soil, arts that teach control before destruction, awareness before aggression, brotherhood before ego, and tragedy before triumph. And yet the legacy will survive, hidden in movements passed from teacher to student, in drills that look simple until you feel how they dismantle you, in modern soldiers and fighters who unknowingly borrow from these principles, rediscovering truths Filipino warriors already knew centuries ago, that warfare is not about the prettiest blade or the longest reach, it is about understanding the human body, the human mind, and the space between them. And as night falls over the island and torches flicker to life, Kalinawan looks at his Kris and understands that it is not soft, not brutal, not mystical, but honest, shaped by reality, and that honesty is what made it revolutionary. And the jungle listens, holding these secrets close, waiting for the next generation to remember what was almost forgotten. Imagine believing the battle is over just because the ground has gone quiet, because silence in the islands is never empty, it only means the world is watching again, and as smoke thins and bodies are carried away, the Filipino warriors do not celebrate, they rebuild their breathing first, because they know what follows survival is adaptation, and adaptation is where true warfare lives, and Kalinawan feels it as he walks deeper into the village, the weight of eyes on him heavier than the Kris at his side, because today he did not just fight, he proved something his people have feared might be forgotten, and the elders gather beneath a great bolete tree whose roots twist like frozen serpents, and there they speak not of victory but of lessons, because a blade is only revolutionary if the mind behind it remains sharp. And as night deepens, rain begins to fall, warm and relentless, drumming against leaves and skin, and under this sound the elders begin to teach, their voices low, carrying memories older than names, explaining that the Kris was never meant to win wars alone, it was meant to change how wars are fought, and Kalinawan listens as they tell him how its waves were forged not just for cutting but for control, for redirecting force, for turning the enemy's strength against itself, because Filipino warfare grew from scarcity, from knowing you would never outnumber your enemy, that terrain was your only ally, and weapons had to compensate for everything you lacked. And as they speak, Kalinawan remembers his training, endless hours of repetition, learning angles instead of power, flow instead of force, learning how the slightest rotation of the wrist could trap a blade, how a step to the side could collapse an attack, and how fear could be used like a weapon if you understood its timing, and this understanding was passed through movement, not books, through brotherhood, not commands, because Filipino martial systems were born in families, in villages, in raids survived and avenged, and as the rain thickens, another group arrives, survivors from neighboring settlements, bringing news that changes the air immediately, because word has spread of outsiders not just raiding but studying, watching, trying to learn how these weapons work, and this worries the elders more than open attacks ever could, because imitation without understanding leads to corruption, And corruption turns innovation into parody, and the elders know that if their weapons are copied without their philosophy, the result will be violence without restraint, and restraint has always been the invisible edge of Filipino warfare, the thing outsiders never saw, because every blade here came with responsibility, with rituals, with rules about when it could be drawn and when it must stay sheathed, and Kalinawan feels the weight of this responsibility growing heavier, because he is no longer just a warrior, he is becoming a carrier of knowledge, and this is where hardship sharpens into something else, because knowledge makes you a target, and as days pass, training intensifies, not to make fighters stronger but to make them adaptable, drills that flow from Kris to barong to empty hand without pause, teaching the body to respond even when the mind hesitates, because hesitation killed Kalinawan's father, and that lesson echoes through every movement, and the warriors train barefoot in mud, on stone, in rain, in heat, because Filipino combat never promised comfort. And through this suffering bonds deepen, laughter breaking through exhaustion, shared food tasted like victory, shared wounds cleaned like sacred acts, and love grows quietly here, not romantic, but the love of knowing someone will stand beside you when everything goes wrong, and tragedy arrives without warning one night when a scouting party fails to return, and by morning only one comes back, wounded, shaken, carrying a broken barong stained dark, and the village understands immediately that the enemy has adapted too, that they have learned to counter the Kris by keeping distance, by using longer weapons, by forcing open ground, and this realization hits harder than any loss, because it proves the arms race has begun, and innovation must continue or die, and this is where Filipino ingenuity shows its true depth, because instead of abandoning their weapons they refine their tactics, learning how to close distance faster, how to use feints, how to throw the enemy off balance with rhythm changes, how to turn even a failed strike into a setup for the next, and Kalinawan is pushed harder than ever, drilled until his hands bleed, until his muscles tremble, because the elders see something in him, a bridge between generations, and they tell him stories of the Panabas, how it was never just a killing tool but a psychological weapon, meant to end fights before they spread, meant to show overwhelming force so villages would think twice before attacking, and this reframes everything for Kalinawan, because he begins to see warfare not as chaos but as communication, every strike sending a message, every movement shaping how the enemy thinks, and as another confrontation approaches, this time larger, more organized, Kalinawan feels fear again, but it is different now, quieter, focused, because fear has become part of the system, not something to escape but something to manage, and when the clash comes it is faster, more brutal, enemies testing new formations, Filipino warriors responding with fluid counters, Kris blades trapping and cutting, Panabas sweeping lanes open, barong fighters slipping inside defenses, and in the middle of it all Kalinawan sees Bato fall, not dead but wounded, and something inside him breaks and reforms at the same time, because grief and responsibility collide, and he steps forward without thinking, his movements smoother than ever, every lesson rising unbidden, and he realizes in that moment that the weapons have done their job. They have reshaped him, turned pain into precision, fear into clarity, and when the enemy finally withdraws again, leaving the ground torn and soaked, Kalinawan kneels beside Bato, holding his hand, promising to carry what he can no longer swing, and Bato smiles weakly, knowing this is how legacies survive, not through domination but through transmission, and as dawn breaks once more, the village stands scarred but unbroken, knowing that what they protect is not just land or life but a way of understanding violence that refuses to become mindless, and Kalinawan looks at the blades laid out for cleaning and sees not weapons but languages, each with its own grammar, its own truth, and he understands now why outsiders could never fully copy them, because without the hardship, the brotherhood, the love, and the tragedies that shaped them, they would always miss the most important edge of all. The elders say that every weapon eventually asks a question of the one who carries it, and by the time the next moon rises Kalinawan understands what that means, because the question is no longer whether he can survive but whether he can preserve what survival costs, and this is the most dangerous battlefield of all, because it is fought inside the mind long after the fighting stops, and as Bato recovers slowly, unable to lift the Panabas that once felt like part of his spine, Kalinawan begins to teach under the same balit tree where he once listened, and teaching changes him in ways combat never did, because now every movement must be explained, every angle justified, every strike connected to purpose, and he realizes that Filipino martial systems were never meant to create killers, they were meant to create thinkers under pressure, people who could read chaos and impose order without losing their humanity, and this realization arrives just as rumors spread of strangers arriving from across the sea, men with unfamiliar armor, unfamiliar discipline, and an unfamiliar hunger, and the village feels the shift before it sees it, the way animals grow restless, the way elders fall silent mid-sentence, because this threat is different, not just another rival tribe but something vast and impersonal, something that will not retreat after a few losses. And as scouts return with descriptions of straight blades that gleam like mirrors and shields that lock together like walls, Kalinawan understands that adaptation must go further than ever before, and the training evolves again, focusing on movement between formations, on attacking joints, on breaking structure rather than chasing kills, because Filipino warriors know they cannot win by matching numbers or armor, they must win by collapsing the system itself, and hardship deepens as supplies run low, as nights grow longer, as families prepare for the possibility of flight or annihilation, and yet brotherhood tightens. Warriors sharing stories of childhood, of first blades held too heavy for their hands, of parents who taught them not how to hate but how to endure, and love shows itself in small ways, in food saved, in wounds tended without complaint, in quiet songs sung to keep fear from swallowing the dark, and when the clash finally comes it feels like the earth itself recoils, metal ringing in unfamiliar rhythms, disciplined ranks advancing into terrain that refuses to obey them, and Kalinawan moves through it like water, not leading from the front but flowing where needed, directing others, trusting the systems that shaped him, watching Kris fighters disrupt shields, Panabas swings create sudden gaps, barong blades slip inside rigid defenses, and for a moment it feels possible, like ingenuity might outpace empire, but tragedy does not need permission, and it arrives when a young warrior freezes, overwhelmed by the scale of it all, and is cut down before Kalinawan can reach him, and that death hits harder than any wound, because it represents the cost of forgetting why these weapons exist, and rage threatens to consume Kalinawan, but the teachings hold, pulling him back into clarity, reminding him that losing control would betray everything they stand for, and the battle ends not in victory but in survival again, the enemy withdrawing to regroup, and the village standing amid ruin, knowing this was only the beginning of something much larger, and as fires burn low and the dead are honored, Kalinawan speaks to the people not as a hero but as a witness, telling them that their weapons will not save them unless their values survive with them, that innovation without identity is just destruction waiting to happen, and years pass and moments after that, the story compressing itself as it always does, because what matters is what endures, and what endures is not the battles but the systems, the drills, the philosophies passed quietly from hand to hand, surviving conquest, surviving erasure, surviving history books that refuse to see them, and generations later these movements will resurface in training halls, in modern combat systems, in hands that never knew the jungle but feel its logic in their bones, and the Kris, the Panabas, the barong will be called many things, exotic, brutal, ceremonial, but those who truly understand will know they were revolutionary because they were honest, because they accepted the reality of violence and refused to let it hollow them out. And as the final torch is extinguished and the belit tree stands unchanged, Kalinawan lays his Kris down one last time, not in surrender but in trust, knowing others will lift it, shape it, adapt it, and remember that Filipino warfare was never soft, never simple, and never forgotten, only waiting for the moment someone listened closely enough to hear what the blades were always saying.